I think one of the things that I often say, and I genuinely believe, is that the core competence of leadership, which also applies to being a good coach or a teacher or whatever, is self-awareness. Because if you don't know what your shit is, how can you work out what's going on around you? And if you're not aware of your own triggers and biases, and we all have them, how can you manage them and make sure you're not just kind of reacting rather than acting? And part of self-awareness is knowing what you're good at and knowing what you're not so good at, and having the humility to get people to help you with certain stuff. And I'm not I consider myself, and still do, even though I was at Sported in the end for 4.5 years, which was longer than I planned. I'm not kind of house trained in the sense of being someone who sits comfortably in an organization for that long on the executive side.
From Coordinate Sport, it's The Drive Phase, a show about sports founders, leaders, and experts and the stories behind their business journeys. Our guest on this episode is Chris Grant. Chris works at the highest level of UK sports administration. He's a specialist in leadership and building consensus, and currently an independent board member of Sport England. In this episode, Chris talks us through his early life growing up in South London, his initial career, and his experience as CEO of Sported for 4 years. Chris's resume is a who's who of top-tier UK sports organisations. He's held board positions at U Sport Trust, the London 2012 International Inspiration Programme, and is currently in the running to become the next FA chairman. We hear his thoughts on the UK sporting landscape and the international perception of the UK in a sporting context. A wide-ranging conversation, valuable takeaways for anyone leading an organisation in sport. Enjoy the show.
Okay, so it's an absolute privilege to welcome Chris Grant to the show this week. He's currently an independent board member of Sport England and has held numerous senior leadership roles in sport administration in the UK. Specifically with Sport England, they've got a pivotal role to play in UK sport. They're investing more than 260 million of lottery funding and exchequer funding, and have actually awarded more than 1,500 awards. Chris, welcome to the Drive Face podcast.
Good to be here, James.
Thank you for your time. I know you so many accomplishments that we've been looking at. It's going to be a struggle to cover everything, so we'll hopefully do it justice and bring some value to the listeners. How we tend to start is just trying to get to know you a little bit better. So you're born and raised in South London, and I'll pass the baton over to you to kind of pick up from that and give us a bit of insight into what that was like in your early years.
So yeah, I was born, as you say, in South London, and from the Jamaican dad, Hungarian mum, both of whom had been in the forces in the Second World War. My mum in the RAF, my dad in the army, and they had a kind of strategy for me and my two sisters. I was the youngest, which was to immerse us in as good an education as we could get, and sport was part of that. So they encouraged us to get active from an early age, and I was always an active child. I was never very good at sports particularly, but I always loved them, and it was part of my upbringing.
Do you feel like that the kind of emphasis on sport was from home, or did you get that? What was your experience like at school? Did you have a good experience at an early age?
Primary school, I went to the local primary school, and I think what was more important to me and in my development at that stage was, I mean, it's weird to call it academic stuff when you're at primary school, at local, just around the corner primary school. But I was very fortunate in that some of my teachers took a real interest in me, and I was able to, all the basic education stuff was important. And I was in my church choir, and I used to sing and stuff like that. The secondary school I went to, sport was a really important part of life there, to the extent that by the time I got to the middle years and the end years of school, I'd be having 12-hour days at school, because I'd be going in early in the morning, we'd be training for something, and then maybe we'd be rehearsing for the play or whatever after school. So I kind of basically lived at school, and we'd organize our own decathlons, just groups of friends, and do these events over 2 days. We do all sorts of stuff, and it was all kind of integrated. I think the world was less pressured in some ways in those days, partly because we didn't have social media or phones and all that sort of stuff, and partly because certainly at the school I went to, they were interested in kind of academic achievement. But as long as you found your kind of niche and you were kind of getting on with stuff, including potentially sport or drama or whatever, they were happy. And so they weren't just always hammering the academic stuff, which I think was really important.
I like that approach, letting you find your way. I'm interested in how you got involved in water polo, because I don't know if South London is a hotspot for water polo when you're growing up. So yeah, I know you obviously Can you expand on that a little bit?
Both my parents were teachers by profession, although my father had been a teacher in Jamaica, and he basically was told after the war, when he was demobbed from the army and was going through the process, he was basically told back in whatever it would have been, the 1950s, that it wasn't appropriate for a black man to be a teacher. So he kind of took a detour and became a kind of bookkeeper. He actually died when I was quite young. But they had decided that what they were going to do, back in those days, you could get a kind of a bursary or a scholarship from a local authority to go to an independent school. So I took the exam and was very fortunate to get into a school which had great facilities and good teachers, also had a swimming pool. And one of the things that we played kind of recreationally was chucking a ball around, and we had some good swimmers. And actually, my year, that was the one thing I've ever won really in sport, was we won the England schools at water polo, and I really loved that sport. So my two main sports that I played at school for school teams were water polo and basketball, and I love them for similar reasons, in a way that technically they're both kind of meant to be non-contact sports, but
it doesn't turn out that way though.
no, it really doesn't. And there's a lot of protecting the ball, and they're real team sports. And I'm actually, so that was 40 years ago. I'm quite old. I'm still, I'm still in touch with most of my old school friends, and particularly the ones who are in that team. We still talk to each other. And I'm sure that's because of the experiences that we had in the pool and just generally playing sport together.
Definitely. And I think we'll probably touch on it later on, but I guess access to that type of sport, I don't know if that's something that drove your, like the talent inclusion advisory group that you're doing at Sport England at the moment.
One of my big things over the years, and I think it kind of started back then, although I wasn't conscious of it in that way, was this, sports social constructs in lots of ways. And a lot of sports, the history of sports is completely intertwined with socio-economic issues, gentlemen and players. So it was about wealth and position in society, but also around race. And, some sports had rules until fairly recently, which prohibited people from certain backgrounds being involved. Yeah. But even though those sports don't have rules anymore, they're still unwritten rules. I reckon there are about a third of our Olympic sports from a Team GB perspective, and probably more in our Paralympic sports, which have never had an athlete representing GB who wasn't white, GB in Northern Ireland. And, so I love it when I hear like Jazzy B from Soul to Soul. He was into ice hockey. And I love it when youngsters like Khadija Mella from Ebony Horse Club in Brixton, get on a racehorse, get some training and win their first race as a hijabi wearing young woman from South London. And that's my dream, really. A big part of my dream is that when, lacrosse, tennis, equestrian sport, swimming, anyone should be able to enjoy them given the chance. And it's not just my dream because that would be a good thing in itself, although that's true. Sport is also a place where people meet, where people learn skills. And for anyone who's interested in social justice and social equality and social mobility, sport, I think, is one of the most effective ways to get there. So one of the things I got involved in around London 2012 was trying to invent a new kind of sports club in the East End of London. And the sport that we used to start off with was hockey. For all sorts of reasons, it never fully came to fruition. But certainly for the young people who got involved at the beginning, for several of them, hockey became their doorway into higher education or into jobs and opportunities in their life that they never would have had in Newham, the backgrounds they had. And it was the hockey bit that broadened their horizons, helped them to meet people. So I'm a great believer in the power of sport to change.
I think, like you said as well, I guess you can remove those restrictions that have been there for years, but then it's almost all got to remove the stigma as well about who plays what sport and kind of break down that barrier. So hopefully we'll touch on that when we look at further on. But I wanted to just go back, I guess, early 2000s, you started the consultancy, the 14A consultancy. What were you doing before that though? So you finished school, academia was really important. What was your transition from school into, I guess there's a gap there that I want to learn about?
Well, the thing I was interested in my studies was literature and languages, and I went and studied French. I got involved accidentally in student politics, and when I say accidentally, it was literally one of those things where
you had to get yourself out of trouble or something, was it?
Yeah, well, it was in my first year, my first weeks at university in Manchester. I had to go and hand in something in the office, the departmental office, and they said, and they must have just had a phone call from the faculty saying we need a student rep from a first year student rep on the faculty committee. So they basically said, do you want to be on
So you literally just walked into it. Yeah.
undemocratic? And I said, yeah, all right. So I started going to these faculty meetings, and it ended up being, it was called general secretary, but it was like president of the Students' Union at Manchester University. And then was asked to go and do a job down in Bristol, which is really fascinating. Was the Polytechnic and became the university. The new director was following on from someone who'd been there for kind of 20 years. And he was a very different character. And he wanted someone to kind of follow him around, sweeping up the mess, or just noting things down. So I was kind of referred to as his kind of minder, because
He sounds like a lot of entrepreneurs I know. Chaos.
He was a very energetic guy, lots of ideas. Every day he'd come up with 5 different things. But he was head of this massive higher education institution, and it was really lucky for me because it meant that my very first job after university, I was sitting in directorate meetings, and so I got to see the whole operation, and it was a massive plus for me, I think. And I still refer back to things I learned then.
Yeah, I mean, so what was the catalyst then to go? I guess go on your own, but start the consultancy in early 2000. And
well, there were other things that happened in between. In that, so when I came back to London, I still worked in higher education, and the institution I worked in, one of the academics started a master's program in group dynamics and organization development. I'd always been fascinated by groups and what happens in conflict and so on. And as an employee, I was allowed to do the masters for free. Right. So I signed up to do the masters, met a guy who ran a consultancy, quite a successful one back then, and joined him pretty quickly. So joined another consultancy where I worked for over 10 years. And we built a business in Russia and in Poland as well, doing human resource development, leadership development, those kinds of things. And then at the beginning of the 2000s, stepped out of that into my own thing. And that was mainly about things that got in the old consultancy, it was wonderful, the work, but we were designing quite complex business simulations for people. And the work we were doing was getting more and more kind of convoluted in a way. What I noticed was that whether it was about leadership development or conflict mediation. So one of the biggest things I was doing, for example, at that phase was I was the chair of the UK Chip and Pin program, which is all the banks and all the retailers having to work together to introduce new technologies for payments. And at the heart of all of the complexity, the thing that made the biggest difference was good conversations.
Just herding the cats, bringing everyone together.
Yeah, and when they get together, it's those moments where they're just sitting there together, having a reflective conversation that's very powerful. And so in a way, 14A, which was my consultancy and is my consultancy, was a way of just going back to some of that simplicity. And that's why my email address is 14, and our website is 14aconversations.com. It's about the power of conversation. One of my favorite quotes about conversation is about conversation not just shuffling the cards. Conversation creates new cards, which has always been my experience.
I was going to say, in terms of what you've brought into the sports sector, probably jumped to 2012, but I guess those having to manage so many moving parts in terms of like that chip and pin program you're talking about, loads of different stakeholders trying to bring them together and build, I guess, consensus, or trying to get the program over the line as well. Has that show you using those skills at the moment with all the roles you're in?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I was proudest of with that work back in the day with chip and pin was that, and it was massive. We routinely refer to it as £1 billion plus program, because if you think about it, and it's not just the big business, it's not just the Tesco's and the Asda's, and it's every petrol station, it's every small shop that needed new technology. So it was a massive program.
You must have been quite ahead of your time as well. So I know, like, even in the US, I don't know how long it took them to get, if they are on chip and pin now.
Yeah, well, it's quite funny. They were one of the last to adopt it, and then in the US, the whole situation around payments is quite funny because still a lot of it is around checks and show them your photo or whatever, and fraud is massive.
Massive data breaches as well. Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah. So it was, the chip and pin program was quite ahead of its time when we did it. The thing I was most proud of was that on the board, which I chaired, we went from a position at the beginning where there was massive conflict, and not just between the retailers and the banks, but within those groups, because they're all competing with each other,
Right.
to rolling this thing out. We never had a vote on anything. We made lots of agreements in our regular meetings, which were all recorded properly, but every single agreement we made was by unanimous consensus. The way I did that, the thing I learned, and one of my catchphrases is shuttle diplomacy. And it's not stitching things up, but it's just doing the legwork in advance of meetings to make sure that people understand what they're being asked to think about, and encouraging them to develop a view. And actually, the other thing that I was very strong on then was what I would call caucusing, which is when you have multi-stakeholder things, a lot of people think it's a bad thing when a little group get in a huddle and decide what they think. So, you get the banks over here and the retailers over there. Or when I did the Olympic and Paralympic Legacy Program, International Inspiration, which I had a similar role on around 2012, if you've got the UNICEF people here and the UK sport people here and the British Council, I encourage that because,
Okay.
if the people from UNICEF and the British Council and wherever, if they know what they think and what they want, and they've worked that out for themselves, then we can get to an answer more clearly. We can find out where the sticking points are. So I encourage caucusing and a lot of pre-work. I learned then that for boards and other kinds of bodies, most of the work is done before the board meeting. The bit after the board meeting is about making sure that people actually do what they said they're going to do, which is another story, but really important, obviously.
You touched on the 2012 the legacy program there, the International Inspiration. Just in terms of, I don't know if the listeners would know it offhand, but if you could give us a little bit of insight into, obviously you were working with various countries, obviously all the Olympic family, was it, or how did that work?
Well, it was so the where that came from was that in 2005, actually, before London won the right to host the games, I chaired for the BBC a national conversation about sport and activity. So they had this kind of roadshow around the country, and I chaired these sessions all around the country, and then the last big one at Television Centre. And I got involved in different things in the Olympic and Paralympic system, mainly the performance part. And then in 2008, well, the reason London won the games, if you remember, back in Singapore in 2005, it was amazing. It's like another era. But in the hall in Singapore, where the decision was made by the IOC, and the voting was going to happen, each bidding city had 100 seats in that hall. And as you can imagine at that time, David Beckham was there, Prime Minister was there, the Mayor of London was there, the great and the good of sport were there. And all of the cities that were bidding, Madrid, Paris, Moscow and so on, were given 100 seats. And all of the other cities, all of their seats were filled up with the great and the good of sport, mainly men, mainly older, blah, blah. London gave half its seats to young people from the east of London. And
Wow.
the whole proposition to the Olympic movement was, the movement are losing touch with young people. We will, if you give us the games, we'll use the games to engage young people and to make a difference in their lives, starting in East London. And, the young people from East London, which are one of the most diverse places on the planet, were part of the team, shaking hands. And they won us the games. We wouldn't have had the games without that. Paris would have got them. So, but then the other part of the promise was we won't just do this for young people in the UK. We will use the fact that we're hosting the games to make a difference in the lives of young people around the world. So International Inspiration set itself the ambition of working with at least 12 million young people in 20 countries, which is a kind of 2012, and set up a new charity which had on its board UNICEF, the British Council, UK Sport, and some other organisations to deliver meaningful programmes in at least 20 countries plus the UK. Ultimately, in a meaningful way. So we're not just talking about throwing a group of kids a few footballs. And
That's something I was going to pick up on, because it's got to be difficult going in. Let's say it's going into another country and not imposing our ideas on them, but maybe their culture, their sporting culture might be different to what we look at it in the UK, and got to navigate that, I guess, as you're going into each of the 20.
Yeah, and I can say this because I can't. It's not me taking credit for it. We did that absolutely brilliantly, because what we did was, working through local partners, we set up a scoping process in each country, which was, we worked at three levels: participants, practitioners, and policymakers. So in the first instance, we engaged with people at all three levels in country. They came together. So you get people from ministries of youth and sport or whatever. You get actual teachers and coaches in communities. You get youth workers and young people. And what we did, and this was building on the expertise of people like UNICEF and the British Council, was they would host a kind of a study week or two where they would think about their own country, think about the issues facing young people, and they would decide what they wanted their international inspiration program to be. So there was no element of us saying, this is what you have to do. So in every country, it was different. In Bangladesh, for example, one of the big issues that they decided they wanted to address was that the cause of death for more young people than any other cause of death was drowning during the monsoon season. And in rural areas, many young people would die every year who didn't know how to swim. So one of the big programs that was set up in Bangladesh was teaching young people to swim. One of the things which came out of that program, which was a kind of semi-intended consequence, it wasn't the centerpiece of it, was that a lot of a lot of the best sport for development programs, in my experience, grow their own coaches, grow their own leaders. So when I was chief exec of Sport, I always loved it when I went to any programs and the people running the sessions were people who'd been participants.
Yeah.
In Bangladesh, in some of those rural villages where there were swim programs going on, they didn't have swimming pools, but they used kind of rivers, safe bits of rivers and whatever. A lot of the coaches were young girls, and what was happening subtly through those programs was that they were opening doors for girls to broaden their horizons, to get more status, to get access to education and opportunities that they never would have. So, it was ticking lots of boxes. In Azerbaijan, the program was much more about young kids with disabilities who were kind of isolated and insulated from, and bringing them together. In Zambia, the program was much more about sexual violence against young girls. So everywhere the program ran, it was different, but sport and activity and a connection to London 2012 was always at the heart of it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just out of interest, I know obviously working with all the different countries, what do you think? It might be different now to what it was back then, but what do you think how do you think the UK is seen on a world stage in the sporting perspective?
I think it's different now to how it was in 2012. Okay. I think 2012 was probably the high point. I hate to say this, in the sense that genuinely, I believe that both the Olympics, so probably even more so around the Paralympics than the Olympics, what we did and what London did, the way we did the torch relays.
Yeah, it's hard to top that though, right? In terms of like that event and that kind of, I guess, that time in history, bringing everyone together to keep that momentum up over the years is difficult.
And it's all, but we could have done a much better job than we have of building from there. Unfortunately, from a social and a political point of view, I think the view of the UK has shifted back maybe to some of the stuff that was there before. I mean, I'm married to a Dutch person. I have lots of friends in different places, and the way that they look at the UK now relative to how they looked at the UK 7-8 years ago is very different. With Brexit, with some of the other stuff that we've done, we're world beating in deaths from COVID. And I think that around sport, but also around other things, people have had a perception of us as arrogant, insular, and I think we've gone backwards on some of that stuff in the last few years. And part of, once again, as a patriotic UK citizen, part of my ambition for the rest of my life is to turn that tide again.
And do you think that's possible without a major event again, like the games, or something to everyone to get behind? Do you think it's
because I always said, and this maybe takes us to Sported, I was very fortunate. Although I was on the board of International Inspiration, which was an official program, one of the things which was great about London 2012 was that there were no freebies. I had to, like everyone else, I was on the website.
A ticket ballot as well. Yeah.
I was applying for tickets, and I never got a ticket to the stadium to see any events in there, and I was gutted by that. But there were lots of people who were gutted, but there were many highlights, of 2012. For me, there was nothing greater than the torch relays. And that first torch relay, the Olympic torch relay, when the torch reached Cornwall and then went all around these islands, what you saw, the people carrying the torch and the people coming out, were these community heroes and heroines,
Yeah.
volunteers, just people, just, and that for me, genuinely, even now when I talk about it, it's the most inspiring bit. And that's always there, James. You don't need, okay, it was the torch relay that brought them out. But as chief exec of Sported, everywhere I went and everywhere I go now with my Sports England hat on or other stuff, I meet amazing people, many of them using sport and activity, but some of them in the arts or just feeding people or whatever now. And they're always there. And so I don't believe we need big events to catalyze this. I think it's a matter of choice and of what we choose to value. Last year, how some of that now once again has faded away, tells its own story. So I'm an optimist about us as a nation and our ability to do really brilliant stuff.
Yeah,
But I'm also a realist about some of the things that get in the way of that.
Yeah, I was going to touch. I mean, like you said, those organisations, they're still there. The community organisations, like you mentioned, Sported, 2,000 plus community organisations. A lot of those, it's a negative. It was a negative event, pandemic, but that kind of brought everyone together as well. So a lot of those organisations were out supporting key workers or supporting people who in need at the time as well. Maybe not delivering support, but using their community. In terms of Sported, I know you got in there when you started. Did you actually launch? What was the origins? Did you launch the organisation? Or I know you
No, so
CEO at a time, but
Sported was founded by Sir Keith Mills, who was the chief executive of the London 2012 bid.
Okay.
It was launched in 2008. I joined in 2014, and I can't take any credit for the scale of Sported, because by the time I joined, it was already UK wide. So I was there for 4.5 years as chief exec, and it was that phase of that really, really tricky phase where it's not a startup anymore, but it's not established yet, where you're trying to consolidate but keep it vibrant. And so I was there, and I was kind of goaded because most of my life I've been a board member or a consultant, so an interventionist in a way. And the challenge that Sir Keith goaded me with was, you're always telling other people how to run their organisations, Chris. Why don't you come and run one for yourself?
Get your hands dirty, yeah.
Yeah, so I did, and of course you don't just get your hands dirty. You just have to dive in. So it's like you're kind of mud wrestling, really.
What were the learnings out of that? Obviously, 'cause pulling together a lot of different groups, I guess, into one, into consensus again. But what would you say your, I guess, recurring challenges were as a CEO at that time?
I think part of it relates to what I've just said, which is that I think one of the things that I often say, and I genuinely believe, is that the core competence of leadership, which also applies to being a good coach or a teacher or whatever, is self-awareness. Because if you don't know what your shit is, how can you work out what's going on around you? And if you're not aware of your own triggers and biases, and we all have them, how can you manage them and make sure you're not just kind of reacting rather than acting? And part of self-awareness is knowing what you're good at, and knowing what you're not so good at, and having the humility to get people to help you with certain stuff. And I consider myself, and still do, even though I was at Sported in the end for 4.5 years, which was longer than I planned, I'm not kind of house trained in the sense of being someone who sits comfortably in an organization for that long on the executive side. So, but that was part of the massive benefit for me, was being out of my comfort zone. So Keith kind of saying, come on, Chris, stop just telling other people, come and do it. Part of what I recognized was that even though I didn't particularly enjoy a lot of it, it would do me a lot of good. And a lot of the stuff that I believe I'm the stuff that are my super strengths, I couldn't use them in that job, which is massively frustrating. But actually,
what's an example of that in terms of not being able to?
So one of the things I mentioned the BBC Sports Summits, for example. I'm pretty good at walking into a room with 200 or 2,000 people and organizing them for a couple of hours so that they get something valuable and have an interesting conversation. I can do that. I've done that a lot. I couldn't do very much of that at Sported. There are lots of other things, that I would have loved to have done at Sported, but we just didn't have the resource. And part of getting the organization, I'm super proud and delighted that Sported just now has been one of the Times and Sunday Times Charities of the Year. So they've been a beneficiary, or they are a beneficiary of the Times Christmas appeal. Eric Dyer, the Tottenham footballer, has been a brilliant ambassador.
And we've got Nicola Walker coming up in the show in a couple of next month. So yeah.
Yeah, and so Sported is there. I always had this image of, I think, another thing about leadership or coaching or anything is that ultimately, I think you have to judge yourself and allow yourself to be judged by what you leave behind. And I had this image, I don't know if you've ever seen those old silent movies, Buster Keaton or whatever, where he walks out of a building and the building just kind of falls over. And he's Steve McQueen, the great director and artist, when he won the Turner Prize, he recreated some of those things where he was standing there and this facade of a building, massive, would just fall over and he'd be in one of the window spaces. And I had this image of walking away from Sported and just hearing it kind of crashing behind behind me as I walked away. And I couldn't have, that would have been awful for all, not for my sake, but for everyone's sake. But I'm so delighted that Sportage has gone from strength to strength. But it was a slog. Anyone who tries to run something in the voluntary kind of sector understands that it's a slog. And that's just the way it is, but it's exhausting.
Yeah, I guess as well, personal pressure is all coming into the role, having the kind of pedigree you had, and like you said, you've been consulting with people and telling them how to run the organisation. You've got to make it successful, I guess.
Yeah, and as you said, and it's come to the fore during the pandemic, but it's always been the case. Ultimately, you're serving. The thing I loved about Sported, in terms of, I love the team, I love the volunteers. We had this amazing national network of volunteers who would be placed into the community groups to support them, to help them build their business plans. And these volunteers are absolutely extraordinary. But more than anything else, it was the work, in the sense of understanding how important the work is that these community groups do. If you took it away, I always said, if you could make the whole community sector go on strike for a month, government would really understand, how important it is. And anyone who does understand how important it is should also understand, it's a bit like what you were saying about the international context. It's no good waltzing into countries and telling them how to do stuff. It's no good waltzing into communities. What I believe in is asset-based community development, ABCD, and Sported was the ultimate capacity builder. Sported wasn't inventing anything at the point I was there. Sported was saying to people, you're doing great work. How can we help? How can we support you? What do you need? How can we get behind you? And still, I still get the funding bulletins. Sported does regional funding bulletins for people, telling them what money is available. Sported still places these amazing business mentors into organizations, none of it at any cost to the community organization. Sported brings together, often the most valuable thing that Sported often did, which was an opportunity for me to use a bit of my strength, was just bringing, community group leaders are often too busy, running sessions.
And doing the job, yeah, exactly.
They're not lucky enough to have your software, James. they're planning their sessions and doing all that stuff. So, but if they get the opportunity to sit in a room, when we're allowed to sit in rooms with people who do similar stuff, they're always amazed, even though they might be, one might be an equestrian group and one might be a midnight basketball group. But when they talk to each other, they discover that 90% of what they're thinking about is the same.
Same challenge, yeah.
And whether they're dealing with horses or shuttlecocks, they're and they love it and they feed off that. So Sported is a capacity builder and an enabler. And it was great, it was wonderful to have the chance to work there. And I was mightily relieved when I stepped away and it didn't.
Just pulling on something you spoke about then, in terms of when you're saying about the impact of community groups, and if they weren't there, we'd see that. I think with sporting organisations, I think there's always that kind of chase for funding, or I guess even validation for what they're doing in the community and the impact it's having. And there's always kind of the annual, is the funding going to be cut or is it available? What your take on that is, from because we're going to talk about Sport England soon, but it's a challenge for our listeners. They're all out there doing their job. I think maybe there's something to be said where we could provide, I guess, evidencing of what sports impact is. We've been talking the whole time, and it's sports the catalyst for all of this positivity. Yeah, I just wondered what your take on that is.
I think as a sector, sports made a lot of progress, but still has a lot of work to do in terms of being able to evidence its positive impact across pretty much every measure that's important. You want to reduce crime in a neighborhood, sport can be quite helpful. You want to increase academic attainment in a school, sport and activity can be pretty helpful. You want to bring communities together post-conflict, or across religious or other divides, sport can. So sport does all these things. I think we're doing a better job of evidencing that now, but I still think that we've got work to do to be able to evidence it. And I think that central government and others and other funders have got some work to do to understand better how they could be supporting and using sport.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to. I guess it's hard to. It's a bit like I was thinking of it as like nutrition or vitamins. Right? If you eat healthily and you take your vitamins, then that generally fixes most health problems, right?
Yeah.
And sport is fixing a lot of problems in society or working towards impacting on a lot of them. But it's hard to say 'cause it's not acute. You can't say, "Well, we did this," and then crime instantly dropped. It's hard to kind of bring all of that data into one report. I guess I don't know how
Well,
people do it, but
I disagree, actually. It's not that hard. And some other sectors are a bit better at doing it than sport. No, I think you can do it. And some
yeah,
people do it. And we ought to be focusing on doing it
we need
better.
to. Yeah, we need to
You know,
get there. Talk to
you
them.
know, but what it often involves is aggregating data from different sources. But, and one of the great things about sport at the performance level is it's data driven.
Yeah,
And one of the reasons why we as a nation are pretty blooming good, second in the Olympic and Paralympic medals tables, producing Lewis Hamiltons and all of those people, is because we're really good at data in those contexts. I don't think we can let ourselves off the hook. And I think, as taking responsibility as an independent board member of Sport England, it's something that Sport England and the other sports councils are working on to get better at. Part of Sport England's job, historically, Sport England dealt with DCMS, culture, media and sport, or digital culture, media and sport now. Increasingly, Sport England needs to and is talking to health, education, the treasury, because of what I just said and what we agree on, which is that sport can help in lots of different places. And actually, yeah, the local police here, they know what the crime levels are. And if you ask local police about the impact of some of the better sports programs, some of which it's not an accident that Muhammad Ali was taught to box by a policeman. Often programs like this are run by the emergency services because they understand that if you want to make a community healthier, it's a bit, as you say, the nutrition argument. So to some extent, James, if I'm really honest, and this also applies around some of the issues around equalities and Black Lives Matter that's happened this year. I don't think it's a conspiracy as such, but I think that sometimes we're a bit afraid of really good data. And so we fudge it when we could be much clearer if we
holding the mirror. Yeah, holding the mirror, holding the mirror up. Yeah. So for Sport England appointment for yourself, I know there's not been many Black board members in the past in the history. I know there's 40-year history. What was, I guess, given your track record, I'm curious to know as well, given your track record in administration and consultancy, etc., you obviously got the appointment on merit. Did you ever feel like there was any kind of, I guess, question of you being on the board?
Well, actually, at the moment, I have to say,
when you went on,
things have shifted a lot in the 4 years since I've been on the board of Sport England, to the extent that now I think it's probably one of the most diverse sports boards around. I think pretty much 40 or 50% are people of colour on the board of Sport England now. It's quite interesting how it shifted.
Was that the case when you joined? Was it 2016 when
I joined in 2016? I was the 5th Black board member, I think, in 40 years, and the only one at that point. Now there are 3 people of South Asian origin, 2 of us of Afro-Caribbean origin on the board. But I think my generation, and unfortunately it's also true of some younger people now, are used to being the first or the only. We're used to being the first or the only. So it wasn't unusual for me to be the only and to be one of the first. And I think one of my catchphrases at the moment is those of us who are in the room have to wedge the doors open. It's no longer good enough to just be there. We've got to think it's another way of thinking about legacy and what you leave behind, is to say we need to make sure that these organisations become more representative over time.
And do you feel that, so when you, obviously back then when you first started, do you feel like you had to push the agenda? Obviously you're on the board now, but is it your response within the boardroom? Was it that we're looking to Chris to push the agenda of diversity, or is it that we're all on that road together? Does that make sense?
It was more the case when I came on. It's less so now.
Obviously, yeah.
That's progress. Well, it's not obvious because it's something that I think you get these ebbs and flows, and I'm really delighted and relieved that it doesn't have to be me pushing the agenda. And by the way, I've always felt that, as a Black man I can be a more effective advocate around, for example, gender inclusion or disability, or it's this whole thing about allyship, which is coming up now more around Black Lives Matter, is quite important, I think, because in a boardroom it's quite a difficult position to be in. And I might look at some stats around, for example, young black people and their levels of activity relative to their desire to be active, where there's a massive gap. And I get quite upset about it because I really identify with that. It goes right back to the beginning about it. And so for me, constantly in a board context, to be the person having to push on that,
Yeah.
it puts you in a weird kind of place. And I'm not complaining about that. It's a fact of life. I'm much more, some of the really complex stuff that's happening now, or I find it complex, around trans issues, for example, or gender identity, or, I can take my commitment to fairness and social justice into that conversation. But also, the other thing, of course, 2 years ago, for example, I chaired the European Retail Real Estate Conference, which was all the big shopping centre owners and, talking about the future of retail. It was in Barcelona, 1,000+ people. And they were talking about, and this was pre-pandemic, but they were talking about the challenge of retail, about online retail, what's the future of bricks and malls and blah, 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 blah. Now, all of this has relevance to sport. So what I don't want to be seen as the black guy who's always going on about diversity.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what will resonate with people as well. That'll resonate, like you said. It's a lot of people have got to be first or only, but then they're the only person who has to push the agenda as well. So that might resonate, being
which
a little bit isolated.
Yeah, but which also means, James, that both you and the organisation lose out on my real expertise, as I've said at the beginning.
Else,
in group dynamics, mediation, organisation development. So
it's not when the story comes out in the paper, or this has happened to whoever, let's talk to Chris about it. It might be that.
I accept that I'm privileged that the paper will come to me and ask for my opinion, and I will give it. But I think from an organisational point of view, Sport England and the sector would lose out if they're not also drawing on what my real experience is.
The reason why you're on the board. Yeah, exactly.
So it's a bit of a catch-22, but it's at the moment it's shifting a bit.
Yeah, in terms of, you spoke about distance travelled on from the board level. From a wider kind of sport industry context, how do you feel that's been over the last? It's potentially quite negative when we spoke about external views of UK, but just obviously, I'm always interested in digital and digital transformation and where are we with everyone adopting and things like that. But where do you feel like we are from where you got into the sports sector administration level to where we are now?
I think we're in quite a good place. And one of the main reasons for that, James, is I'm a mentor, or I have been a mentor for the last 3 or 4 years on a program called Next Gen, Sport Industry Next Generation, and every year about 30 young leaders from across, commercial, NGBs, different organizations, they come together on this program. And they're amazing. Every year they have blown me away, and I look at them, the diversity and the willpower and the brain power and the skills in that group, and some of the jobs they're already doing at a young age give me optimism for the future of sport. The other thing I do is I chair the judging of the Sport Industry Awards, and have for the last 5 years. So I get to see the kind of all the nominees pitching their programs, their events, their tournaments, their technology. And there's a massive amount of powerful innovation and good practice going on. It's interesting how some of the older brands in sport, the Wimbledons of this world, actually are often on the leading edge of some of this stuff. And I really admire that. So all of that gives me cause. When I survey the industry as a whole, I think there's lots of reason to be confident.
Just a slightly off topic, well, maybe not off topic question, but I know you've been open with your desire to be the next chairman of the FA. I guess it's for all of the above, really, everything we've been talking about. But what if you were to be successful in that role? What do you think your kind of action plan would be, your first 100 days? And I guess also, do you think being a Crystal Palace fan will go against you in the in the recruitment process?
Yeah, my first act will be that any team wearing red and blue in South London, men's and women's, gets a bye to the semi-final of the FA Cup. Obviously,
yeah, no relegations or anything. Yeah,
well, they'll probably still manage to mess it up somehow or another. But I mentioned earlier, I think a similar thing applies, as I talked about in the community setting, which is about asset-based community development. And my sense of football, I've been chairing a program in professional football for the last 18 months, which has given me an insight into the Premier League, the Football League, and the league managers and professional players organisations, as well as the FA. And of course, from the Sported days, there were lots of football groups who were in Sported. And Sported is a bit like a national governing body. It looks after these clubs. What I know is that football has massive assets. So, and many of those assets are, you've got the obvious ones, like, so the Premier League, its global presence is a massive asset, but there are lots of less obvious ones, the local ones, the nutrients in the soil, those same volunteers and clubs. So, and because I believe in leveraging assets as a better way of getting progress than trying to invent new stuff, I think my first 100 days would be about that shuttle diplomacy that I mentioned earlier. It'd be about, if we're allowed out, it'll be being in places with people, with the county football associations, with the local clubs, with the amazing groups. I visited a group a while ago when I was at Sported with Prince Harry. We went to see the Sir Tom Finney Football Club just outside Preston. It's an amazing football club running massive numbers of teams and, amongst other things, doing brilliant work with recently arrived refugees in the northwest of England, and using that international language that football is to help people land in the community and help break down barriers.
It's probably the best way to get acclimatized, right?
Yeah. So but that's just one of many, many, many examples. So I think that, and I think it's there in the chair role that you have to embrace the whole of the system, and football is a massive system. So that would take a lot of the first 100 days. I think that other things that football needs to look at are the distribution of resources. So, so through the pandemic, there has been, the Premier League bailout of the Football League, ultimately, really amazing issues around the women's game. The women's game, in a way, for me, although the women's game actually is well over a century old, and at certain points was in that century was thriving as much as the men's game. The women's game in its current incarnation, to me, is a bit in that Sported phase. Like the last few years have been a restart for it. 3 or 4 years from now, we want the women's game at all levels to feel as solid and established and so on. So I think there's some work to be done around that, around the distribution of resources. Clearly, there are issues around the workforce and the volunteer force and diversity. And football has expressed some ambitions around that, which I agree with, put in place some mechanisms. From a systems change point of view, I think it needs really smart stewardship to actually bring that stuff to life. Because if you talk to, for example, to retired players who've had aspirations as coaches over the last 50 years, they've been disappointed so many times that some of them have almost lost faith. And I think one of the things that, once again, from the chair's point of view, that you have to do is make people believe in football at its best is inspirational. When we had, I remember Euro 96, for example, and what that did, it was just an amazing time. To me, it was up there in a way with 2012, but it was better because it was national, it was nationwide. I hope we may get some tournaments in the next, we're meant to host parts of the European Championships finals, but I hope we'll get some tournaments. It's about all those different assets and helping them understand, a bit like the chip and pin bit, that one part of the system's success can actually support another part of the system's success. So it's not a zero-sum game where if the professional game wins, the national game loses, or if we're trying to use football for educational development, it means that you're not allowed to focus on football just purely for enjoyment, that, all of that sort of stuff. I think the game is ripe for unification, and that would be my aim.
Oh, I love that. I mean, just to, I guess, pick up, and I'm tight on time, I wanted to pick up what we always try and look at is, you personally, how do you perform, right? So it's kind of, do you have any habits or routines, things that you do to kind of peak performance? Just really curious, like, do you have like a morning routine that you always do, or anything that's in place?
Yeah, so part of it is quite well established, and some of it like many people, I've discovered during lockdowns. So the bit which is well established for me is walking. So when I was going to meetings and so on, I was really one of those people who would do my best to walk between appointments or whatever. And my family accused me of being slightly obsessive about 12,500 steps a day.
Get a
And
tracker on, yeah.
part of my defense is, well, there are worse things to be obsessive about.
Yeah, true.
To the extent that even sometimes, if it's like 10:30 at night and I realize I've only done like 10,000, I'll go and walk around the block. The new bit that I discovered, which is massive for me and so important, is yoga with Adrienne. I mean,
I know that one. They're the 30 days. Yeah.
she does these 30. I mean, I'm in my late 50s, and I've tried yoga and other things at earlier stages of my life, and never been able to get over that initial. I don't feel like a flexible person. Classes actually are intimidating. There's not much that I'd much rather. If you'd asked me 2 years ago, would you rather walk in a room of 1,000 people you don't know and have to run off the top of your head a session for them about a topic that you know nothing about, or would you go to a yoga class around the corner? I'd much rather run that session with 1,000 people because I find it intimidating. So doing it here, being able to, next to my wife now, and with just a little screen, and I've been doing it pretty much since March every day, every morning.
Do you think you'd ever go to a class then? No. Now that you've got the basic, or how advanced you are now, but do you think you'd ever go to a class, or is it the fact that you're doing it at home that's
a good question? To be honest, I wouldn't hugely see the need. I think what I'd be more likely to do if I ever got the chance would be to go on a kind of a short camp or workshop.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily see the need to go to a weekly class, but now that I know what a downward dog is and I can do one,
it's getting up from it after you've done it.
That is the thing. But it's a really interesting question, because I think I don't need, and I don't do it for the social interaction. I can see, classes are amazing because feeling that sense of shared purpose, and going right back to the beginning of this interview, and team sports. I love team sports. So I love basketball and I loved water polo. And although I've never been very good at it, I love playing football because of the team aspects. The yoga for me, and the walking to a great extent, is my going inside time. And so to go back to the heart of your question, James, it's self-care and reading, listening on a limited basis to some podcasts. Those kinds of things feel very important to me. I've learned it in lots of different roles. The old cliche about from the aeroplane safety briefing that, before you put someone else's mask on, put your own mask on. Health is a key deliverable for leaders. I think healthy organizations, healthy teams. So you can't ignore your own health. Unhealthy leaders rarely lead healthy organizations, in my experience. And so it's a matter of responsibility to look after yourself as best you can.
Oh, thanks. Just while you mentioned books, do you have any book recommendations or books that you might gift people, other potential leaders, like you do your mentorship program? Do you recommend any reading or any specific books? I know there's one in particular. It's just there it is. Yeah.
I mean, this was published in June, Better Decisions. And
I've ordered my copy. My copy's ordered already. So.
Good. Well, I hope you find it useful. There's very little in it that's original, but it's I've been working with groups and leaders for 35 years now, and so it brings together some of the principles, and is also designed not just to be about work. It's about those personal things that you might need to be thinking of. There have been books that have been quite influential for me in different ways. I mean, one of the things I say is that from a learning point of view about life and business, I think I've probably got more out of novels than I have out of business books.
Really?
So if you read Tolstoy or modern novels, even like something like Normal People, Sally Rooney, which made a big splash on the television, what you're learning about is the inner lives of people. And once again, whether you're a sports coach, one of the big challenges I think for sport and activity is that most of us who love sport find it really hard to put ourselves in the shoes of people who don't. And actually, most people don't love sport. They don't love doing it. And as a nation, if we're going to get active, those of us who are the facilitators of activity need to be able to put ourselves in the minds of people who are like me, intimidated by yoga or whatever. But that applies to everything. And reading novels gives you a gateway into the inner lives of others. So I actually think when I think of some of the most powerful books that I've read in the last couple of years that have taught me most, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Blimey, do you learn about power and organizations and the relationship between what goes on in your family and what goes on at work. It's amazing. But then there are books like Synchronicity, not the Carl Jung one, but the Joseph Jaworski one. Jaworski was the son of the chief prosecutor Watergate in the States with Richard Nixon. And he wrote a book about his personal journey, which was towards understanding how he'd been restricting himself through limited thinking. So I do like books like that. But as I say, more than business books, it's kind of novels.
Last question from me, and it's taking you all the way back. So if you could go back in a time machine, go back to a 20-year-old Chris, what advice would you give yourself at that point in your life that would help in your future career as a leader?
I think the thing that would have served me a lot if I discovered it earlier, if I could have had that kind of time machine loop, would have been about the self-care and space for reflection. There's another book called Time to Think by Nancy Klein, which is actually I'd come across before, but it's been recently recommended to me and I've just got it back. And Time to Think, the fact that like lots of 20-year-old males, I think, and females, but there's a masculine issue here. I equated productivity with busyness and desire and will and the older I get, the more I understand that my most productive moments are often when I kind of unclench myself. And it is and it's not necessarily when I'm on the walk in Greenwich Park or wherever that the ideas come. But when the ideas do come, what I realize is that they wouldn't have come if I hadn't had the walk. So I think I would have been a little less driven at 20. But who's to say that maybe that's what I needed to be at that stage. So yeah, but that would probably be, and yoga. Like if YouTube had existed when I was 20, I've just the capacity to, to pick something up off the floor.
You might be living in Thailand though as a yogi by now. If you started back then, yeah.
I could be. But having just watched the series on BBC One, The Serpent, about the serial killer in Thailand, it's actually it made me think twice about going there.
Exactly. No, Chris, once again, so grateful for your time and thank you for sharing it with us. Really insightful, and I'm sure our listeners will love the episode today.
Well, I hope they do. And thank you for giving me the opportunity, and enjoy the book. And I wish you well, James.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this week's show. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can write to us at dryphase.podcast@coordinate.cloud, tweet us at coordinatesport, or follow us on Instagram at coordinate_sports, or on my account at James_ventures. This episode was produced by Nancy Kwamboka, with support from Claire Goodchild and Lola Small, with special thanks to Rochelle. I'm James Moore, and you've been listening to The Drive Phase from Coordinate Sport.